Tonight, let us drift into the hush of myth and ember, to hear of a child not carved by Olympus, but born in the forge of Earth itself. Take a moment to follow along and subscribe, only if stories woven with myth and wonder are what you enjoy. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time of night is it for you? Sometimes these tales carry you gently into rest, and other times they spark dreams that burn brighter than sleep itself. So settle in, lower the lights, let the quiet hum of the room surround you, and together we'll step into tonight's story. His name was Arion, forgotten by the songs of men, yet etched in fire and iron. He was no simple wanderer, for his path would cross the underworld, trickster gods, and prophecies carved in thunder. And at the center of it all, a single blazing task: to reclaim the eternal flame and return warmth to a world that had grown cold. It began in a small city of smoke and sweat, where men bent iron into shape with hammer and prayer. Among them lived Callista, a blacksmith whose hands rivaled those of the gods. She was no maiden of silk, nor queen of perfume. She wore soot as war paint and carried the scent of pine smoke. Her hammer struck bronze with a rhythm that seemed alive, and weapons forged by her hand were said to hum with power. Even the gods noticed, though only one descended: Hephaestus, the lame god of the forge, outcast of Olympus. He came not with gifts or decrees, but with silence. He watched her work, and in her movements saw a reflection of his own exile. From that night, a child was born, a boy who did not cry, but opened his eyes glowing like coals. The midwives whispered in fear, "He is touched by fire." Another muttered, "He will not remain here long." Callista named him Arion. At 5, he shaped iron with skill beyond grown men. At 7, he forged a flawless blade, warm to the touch. Yet the village feared him. Priests refused him blessings. Children avoided him, calling him cursed, the child of a god who had no throne. But Callista loved him fiercely, teaching him that fire listened, but never obeyed the arrogant. As Arion grew, the world dimmed. Hearths that once glowed with ease faltered. Crops withered. Storms stretched longer than seasons. Old women prayed to ashes that gave no warmth, and whispers grew that the gods had abandoned mankind. High on Olympus, the truth was crueler still. The last pure flame had been locked in a brazier, sealed away from mortals forever. The gods feared man's rebellion, feared Prometheus's defiance. They told themselves, "Let mortals suffer, for they must remember their place." Yet not all gods agreed, and in secret, whispers spread of a boy born of fire whose fate was tied to the flame. Nymphs saw sparks dancing in his eyes. Dryads murmured of a name carried on the wind. In Delphi, the oracle dreamed of fire, walking on 2 legs, lighting the world with its footsteps. And in the silence of ruined temples, forgotten candles sputtered to life at the sound of his hammer striking iron. When Arion turned 16, his forge burned day and night. He shaped weapons, For kings he would never meet, for armies he would never see. But something stirred in him, something that told him he was not born to serve, but to change the world. One night, he climbed the ruined steps of Delphi, where the oracle still lingered though the temple lay broken. She sat blind-eyed on a crumbling throne, skin pale as ash. When Arion entered, the torches lit themselves and thunder murmured over the mountains. The oracle inhaled sharply and spoke his name, though it had not been told to her. "You will climb Olympus," she hissed. "You will take the flame, and you will die." Her words were no riddle, no rapture, only a sentence. But Arion did not flinch. "Then let me pay the price," he answered. The oracle laughed softly, not cruelly, but with sorrow, as though she had seen too many end the same way. "You already are." The oracle's words lingered like smoke, even after Arion left Delphi. He returned to his forge, but the metal no longer bent as easily. The flames resisted. The iron cooled too quickly, as though the world itself were reminding him of what awaited. He knew then his path would not be simple. The eternal flame was not a gift left unguarded. It was bound by trial. And before one could climb Olympus, one had to pass through shadow. Whispers spoke of a gate at the mountain's roots, a place where stone gave way to silence. It was not marked by temples or altars, only by absence. Travelers who drew near claimed the air grew heavy, that the wind scraped the soul instead of the skin. There, they said, waited Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, keeper of the underworld's threshold. None could cross without touching death itself. Arion prepared, but not with sword or armor. For 3 nights, he worked without sleep, forging something unlike any weapon he had ever made. He shaped a collar from obsidian and black iron, fusing into it the last ember taken from his mother's forge. Upon it, he carved 3 words, one for each head of the beast: memory, grief, loyalty. When it was finished, the metal pulsed faintly, as though it too remembered loss. On the 4th day, he journeyed to the cave. The air grew colder the closer he came. Not the bite of winter, but a chill that sank into bone and thought. The cave's mouth yawned, like the opening of a wound, and beyond it stretched a darkness that seemed to have no end. Arion stepped inside. He walked past bones that glowed faintly, past torches that burned without flame. The deeper he went, the more the silence pressed against him, until at last he heard it, a breathing vast and layered, 3 storms dreaming in unison. He entered a clearing of ash and saw the beast. Cerberus slept upon a bed of bone, fur blacker than void, each head twitching in separate rhythm. Its ears flicked though its eyes remained closed, sensing the intruder. Arion did not raise his hammer, did not draw his blade. He knelt, laying the collar gently on the ground before him. And then he began to hum. It was a song not of conquest, but of comfort, the lullaby his mother once sang when night made the world feel too wide. The sound was quiet, almost broken, yet it filled the cavern like a memory too heavy to leave. One head stirred, the middle lifted slightly, amber eye glowing. The right snarled, teeth bared, but then stilled. The left tilted curiously, listening. Slowly, the beast lowered its gaze to the collar. Arion whispered the 3 words, each one a promise: memory, grief, loyalty. He reached forward and clasped the collar around the central neck. Cerberus exhaled, a sound like mountains shifting, and the stone gate behind him opened, not with rage, but with recognition. Death had tested him, and death had stepped aside. The path to Olympus began not in light, but in descent. Yet now, at last, the climb awaited. The climb was not a path, but a trial. The roots of Olympus rose before him in jagged walls, each ledge cut by storm and silence. The wind tore down the cliffs like voices of the ancient dead, urging him to turn back. But Arion climbed, bare hands bleeding against rock, divine fire pulsing faintly in his chest, like a second heart. The mountain resisted him. Stone crumbled under his feet. The sky darkened. Thunder rolled without rain. At times he thought the mountain itself alive, shifting to cast him down. Still, he pressed upward, each step heavier than the last. It was there, on a narrow ledge where lightning danced across the horizon, that a figure appeared, not in thunder, not in fire, but with the silence of a shadow. He was dressed as a traveler, cloak loose about his shoulders, sandals laced with wings. A coin spun casually between his fingers. His grin was crooked, his eyes sharper than glass. Hermes, messenger of gods, thief of stories. "Well," Hermes said, tilting his head as though examining a curiosity, "I thought you'd be taller." Arion kept climbing, hands steady on the stone. Hermes drifted beside him, though he never moved his feet. "I know why you're here," he went on. "The flame. You want to return it to mortals. Sweet, noble, foolish." "Then stop me," Arion muttered, without pausing. Hermes chuckled, spinning his coin faster. "Stop you? Oh no, boy. I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to remind you what bargain you're walking into. That fire is not a gift. It's a weight, and it will burn away everything you are." At that, Arion paused, meeting the god's gaze. If it must, then let it. The grin faltered. For the first time, Hermes' eyes hardened. He stepped close, pressing 2 fingers against Arion's chest. At once, a searing thread twisted through his soul. Not pain of flesh, but of spirit. "There," Hermes whispered. "My gift, a curse, if you like. The flame you seek will eat you from within. Each step you take will cost you more of yourself. By the time you stand before it, you may not remember what you were." The coin vanished. The god's wings twitched, and with a rush of wind, he was gone. The mountain groaned. A storm gathered, not of rain, but of consequence. Arion pressed forward, breath shallow, fire inside him, smoldering like a wound. The curse had already begun. The climb became torment. His lungs burned as though frost filled them. His skin seared with heat from within. And every heartbeat scraped against the curse Hermes had sown into him. The higher he rose, the more the mortal world slipped away. Birds vanished. Trees ceased to grow. Even the stars above seemed to withdraw. Yet he climbed still, thinking of cold children by empty hearths, of his mother's hands blistered in the forge. The gods watched in silence, their whispers carried by thunder. They waited for him to fall, but he did not. At last, after blood and breath had nearly abandoned him, he rose above the clouds, and there, at the mountain's crown, he saw it, a clearing without wind, a pedestal of stone blackened with age. Upon it burned the eternal flame. It was not red nor orange. It was white, pure, blinding, alive. Arion stepped forward, the fire inside him answering like a lost sibling. He reached out his hand. The summit of Olympus was nothing like the songs of bards. No golden halls, no trumpets of welcome, no gods waiting with crowns or fury. Only silence, a windless clearing of stone, blackened as if scarred by centuries of thunder. And at its center, raised upon a pedestal carved from rock older than language, burned the flame. It was not fire, as mortals knew it. No flicker, no wavering tongue of red or orange. It shone white, pure, alive, a flame that watched, a flame that remembered. Orion's steps faltered as he neared, not from fear, but from recognition. The ember Hermes had cursed into his chest now throbbed like a second heartbeat, pulling toward the brazier as if to reunite with its kin. The air around him warmed, but it was not heat, it was memory. He saw flashes. The first campfire lit in a cave, the forge that raised cities from dust, the torch that defied the dark at Troy. The flame carried not just warmth, but history. He stretched out his hand. The fire leaned forward as if reaching for him. The moment they touched, time cracked. Arion fell to his knees as the flame poured into him. Not burning, but rewriting. His bones trembled, his skin blazed, his veins glowed like rivers of molten light. He was no longer a vessel of flesh, but a forge remade. The brazier sputtered, dimmed, then fell cold. The eternal flame was no longer chained to Olympus. It lived inside him. The storm above cleared at once. The mountain that had fought him at every step grew still. Stone shifted beneath his feet, not to throw him, but to guide him. Even the air softened, as though Olympus itself recognized what he had become. Arion staggered as he descended. Each breath was a burden, for the flame within him pressed outward, seeking release. And with each step down the mountain, the world answered. Frost melted, winds gentled, crops stirred with life. In a village far below, a hearth that had been ash for months flared suddenly to life, and the people gasped. In another, a dying forge roared back into flame without coal or spark. Across valleys and empires, warmth returned, as though the world itself were exhaling relief. When at last Arion stepped into a frozen village, the people gathered, not in fear, but in awe. He raised his hand, and from his fingertips leapt a spark that danced into the nearest hearth. It blazed to life. Then another, and another. Fire spread from home to home, not destroying, but rekindling. Children cried out in joy. Elders whispered blessings they thought long forgotten. The people did not call him God, nor king. They called him warmth. Yet the fire within him was no gentle thing. His skin shimmered like obsidian cracking. His hair glowed like molten gold. He was breaking apart, piece by piece, as though too small a vessel for what he carried. Still, he smiled, for the flame was no longer Olympus's to hoard. It belonged to every home, every forge, every shivering child. Arion had not stolen the flame. He had become it. And everywhere it burned, his name was whispered, not in worship, but in gratitude. The descent from Olympus was not a triumphal march, but a quiet surrender. Each step drew more of him away. His body was no longer flesh as mortals knew it. His veins pulsed with light, his skin cracked like cooled obsidian, and smoke curled softly from his hands. Where his feet touched the earth, frost retreated, grass stirred, and rivers thawed. The curse Hermes had sown into him gnawed deeper, but it could not break what he had already chosen. Villagers whispered of a figure who passed through in silence, leaving warmth in his wake. In one hamlet, a child pointed to the fire and claimed a man of light had touched it before it flared to life. In another, a blacksmith found his forge ablaze, though no coal remained, and swore he heard a hammer's rhythm in the crackle of the flames. Across the land, stories spread, not of a god, not of a conqueror, but of a boy who had carried fire back from the unreachable mountain. But each gift cost him more. His hair burned to ash, leaving only a faint golden glow. His breath came ragged, sparks tumbling from his mouth with every exhale. He was not fading from weakness, but transforming into something the mortal tongue had no name for. He reached the village of his birth, last. Callista's forge had long since cooled, the anvil rusted, the hearth dark. Arion entered quietly. No crowd awaited him, no priests, no chorus of praise, only memory. He laid his hand upon the cold anvil. At once, flame leapt, white and alive, filling the forge with heat so radiant it seemed to breathe again. For a moment, those who passed by claimed they saw him standing there, hammer in hand, working as he had when he was a boy. But when they entered, the forge was empty. Only the fire remained, bright and eternal. Then one day, he was gone. No tomb was built for him. No temple bore his likeness. He left no ashes to scatter, no relic to guard. But in the years that followed, strange things stirred. Hearths across villages lit themselves at dusk without tinder. Forests once frozen bloomed overnight. Wanderers huddled in the cold awoke to find fires dancing unbidden at their campsites. Some said, when their flames flickered strangely, it was Arion passing by. Others swore, if you listened close enough, you could hear a hammer's rhythm hidden in the crackle of the fire. Steady, patient, eternal. He was never worshipped, never crowned, yet he was never forgotten, because Arion had not died in the way mortals die. He had surrendered body and voice, becoming spark and warmth itself. Not a god, not a hero, just a boy who gave everything so that humanity might remember how to glow again. And thus his story lived, not in marble statues or golden hymns, but in every candle lit by grieving hands, in every torch lifted against the dark, in every hearth where children gather close and dream. Arion never ended. He became the fire. Far from the forges of Arion's birth, in the stone-bound land of Sparta, another story was quietly beginning. Sparta, where boys were taught to fight before they could speak, where discipline was carved into the bone, and where women bore strength no less fierce. Among them was Leonthy, daughter of Adrastos, a commander whose name carried iron in its syllables. She was born under a blood-red eclipse, an omen that unsettled the midwives. Some whispered she had descended from Ares himself. By 12, she was stronger than her brothers, and by 16, she led hunting parties through the Taygetus Mountains, returning with wild boars tied to her chariot. She moved through the Spartan agora with a spine so straight that men lowered their eyes and women looked on with envy and awe. But what no one saw was the silence in her heart. When the armor was removed and the torches dimmed, Leonthy lay awake, staring at the stars, not with the hunger of a warrior, but with the wonder of a child. She yearned for something Sparta had no word for. Not conquest, not marriage, but magic, stillness, peace. Every full moon, her body drew her away from the barracks and training fields up toward the cliffs above the Eurotas River. There, she shed the weight of steel and wandered beneath the sky, only a woman walking alone. And one night, when the moonlight was so silver it seemed carved from a blade, she found it. A grove hidden between cliffs, untouched by soldiers' boots. At the grove's center lay a pool, still as polished glass. Gliding across it was a swan. Its feathers shimmered like woven starlight, neither white nor gray, but something unearthly. Its long neck arched gracefully, and its eyes, gods, its eyes were aware, watching her not as prey, but as equal. Leonthy froze. Her training whispered caution. Nothing in nature moved so perfectly. Yet the swan did not flee. It drifted closer, bowed its head, and waited. Slowly, she knelt at the water's edge. Reaching out, she brushed its feathers. Warm, unnaturally warm, as though sunlight itself coursed through its body. A strange stillness bloomed inside her chest. Not fear, not desire, but connection. The swan turned and glided back to the center of the pool. Leonthy remained there, heart steady, breath calm. She knew, without knowing how, that this moment was no accident. The next full moon, she returned, and the swan was waiting. Again, the month after, and again after that. It became a ritual, unspoken, unbroken. She brought offerings, figs, olive wood carvings, linens soft as river reeds. The swan never touched them, never acknowledged, yet still it came. And each time Leonthy spoke, not like a commander giving orders, but like a woman who had never been heard before. She spoke of her father's coldness, of victories that left her hollow, of nights when the stars felt closer than any Spartan ally. The swan never answered, but she knew it listened. Its silence was not absence, it was attention. And in that silence, she felt less alone than she had in all the bustling camps of Sparta. In time, she stopped questioning. She braided her hair before each meeting. She smoothed her robes. She sat beside the bird for hours, shoulder-touching wing, speaking little, feeling much. Her heart softened, her edges blurred, and though she never said the word aloud, she knew it. Love. But the swan was no mortal creature. Its wings had once stretched across the heavens. Its fingers had once played the lyre that brought dawn. For it was Apollo, god of music, prophecy, and light, bound into feather and silence. Long ago, Apollo had spoken truth against Zeus, defying his father's cruelty. For this, he was cursed, not slain, not stripped of all power, but trapped in a body of feathers, unable to speak, unable to reveal himself. Worse still, the curse held one rule. If any mortal learned his true name, the transformation would become permanent. And so Apollo waited, hidden across centuries, silent on lakes and groves, watching the world forget his temples. Until Leonthy found him. Her presence cracked something long buried. Hope. She was no priestess, no oracle, no chosen nymph. She was a warrior, hardened by loss, who still carried a softness she did not show to her world. She saw him not as a god, not as a symbol, but as a companion. And he, bound in silence, loved her back. But Sparta noticed. Warriors whispered that she wandered too often. Her father Adrastos questioned why her eyes had softened, why her strikes lacked venom. Priests muttered about omens, about the moon stirring unnaturally over the hills. Suspicion grew. Yet still, Leonthy returned to the grove. Still she knelt by the swan, unafraid. And still the truth waited, patient as the moon. The moon grew heavy in the sky, low and swollen, like a dying flame. Leonthy fastened her armor, but could not close the final clasp. Her hands trembled, her breath uneven. For days she had felt it, a tremor beneath her feet, a tension in the air, as if the world itself waited. When she reached the grove, the swan was already there, but it was restless. Its feathers bristled, its movements sharper, its eyes clouded with something she had never seen in them before. Sorrow. It circled her twice, then settled, warmth bleeding from its body in waves that no longer comforted but burned. That night, she dreamed of a statue, half man, half swan, cracked with golden light, eyes empty yet unyielding. She awoke with a name on her tongue, a name she had never spoken, but one that burned her lips like prophecy. Apollo. The next day, she followed an unmarked trail deeper into the hills. Beneath vines and moss, she found an altar long abandoned. The inscription was faint but unmistakable, carved in flaking gold, Apollon. Her chest tightened. All the offerings, the warmth, the silence. It had never been an ordinary swan. She staggered back as the sound of feathers swept behind her. He had followed her. The swan stood at the edge of the grove, watching. Its glow dimmed, its wings lowered, as if it already knew the truth had arrived. Leonthy whispered, trembling, "I know." The wind stilled. The water in the pool shivered. A single feather drifted from the swan's back and disintegrated into dust before it touched the altar. Then the transformation began. The swan convulsed, its neck arching, feathers unraveling into streams of gold. Its wings bent into arms, webbed feet split into toes, and where the bird had stood, now knelt a man, naked, radiant, and broken. His hair glimmered like dawn. His skin shone faintly like embers beneath marble, but his eyes carried sorrow deeper than night. Leonthy fell to her knees. She had loved him in silence, and now silence was unbearable. He tried to speak, his voice cracked and ancient, thunder contained in breath. "You were never meant to know," he whispered. "It was the only rule." "I didn't mean to," she choked, tears streaming down her face. He smiled faintly, like a farewell. "I know." Then the curse descended. The ground trembled with silent fury. Apollo's skin hardened, veins of marble crawling across his body. His golden hair dulled, stiffening into stone. His arms, still reaching toward her, froze mid-motion. His face, caught between love and pain, solidified into eternal silence. Wings half-formed behind his shoulders stiffened. Jagged feathers turned to rock. Leonthy clutched his hand as long as she could, feeling warmth fade into cold. "No," she whispered. "Not like this." But the curse did not listen. It had waited centuries, patient and merciless. Apollo's chest rose once more, then stilled. His eyes, open but unseeing, locked forever on the place where she knelt. And then he was stone. Leonthy pressed her forehead against his frozen hand, her warrior's tears cutting through ash and dust. She did not scream. She did not curse the gods. There was no one to hear her, no Spartans to witness, no priests to judge. Only the trees, the moon, and the silence of a god who had once loved her with stillness. She never returned to Sparta. She left her armor by the altar, her sword abandoned at the grove. The woman who had been forged to fight now lived only to remember. Each full moon, she returned to sit by his side. She brought no offerings, no prayers, no incense, only herself. She would rest her hand on his stone fingers, whisper stories of her days, or hum softly, as if he still listened. Sometimes she smiled, sometimes she wept. Always she stayed. Years passed. She grew older, but never frail. Her strength was no longer like a soldier's, but like an olive tree's, enduring, rooted, patient. Apollo's statue never changed. Some travelers who stumbled upon the grove claimed the stone was warm to the touch, that if you pressed your ear to his chest, you could hear the faintest echo of a heartbeat. At last, one final full moon came. Leonthy arrived, sat beside him as she always had, and laid her head gently on his shoulder. She closed her eyes. She did not move again. When villagers found her, weeks later, she was still there, peaceful, lips curved faintly in a smile. Apollo's statue shimmered faintly in the moonlight, as if lit from within. No shrine was built, no temple raised, but the legend spread. And so it was told, when the moon is full and the wind is still, a swan glides silently across hidden waters, not to be seen, but to remember. Far from Sparta, far from forges and gods turned to stone, another tale lingered like music on the wind. The story of Melanian, a boy born not to fire or battle, but to song. He entered the world beneath a willow tree during a storm that split the sky in two. His mother swaddled him in linen while thunder rolled and rain beat the earth, but the child did not cry. He hummed, soft and steady, as if the storm itself had given him a melody. By 10, he could mimic the song of any bird. By 16, he played the lyre so beautifully that hardened warriors paused mid-step, eyes wet with memories they had buried. He wandered from village to village with no demand for coin, singing of rivers, of loss, of love before war. It was said his voice calmed fevers, that his strings soothed even the dying into peaceful sleep. People called him a gift, touched by divine breath, and the gods noticed. One evening, as Melanian sat by a river, strumming to the rhythm of starlight, the world stilled. The water froze mid-ripple, the frogs silenced, the very air held its breath. From the veil of the unseen stepped the muses, 9 in number, cloaked in light and sound. They listened, and then, astonishing him, they sang back. 9 voices in harmony, older than time. Melanian closed his eyes and joined them, not echoing, but evolving their song, weaving his own thread into their eternal tapestry. When the last note faded, even the stars seemed closer. The eldest muse touched his brow and said, "You are not ordinary. You are a vessel." So began his legend. He walked with them into the sacred slopes of Helicon, where few mortals had ever tread. There he learned not through lessons, but through experience. Clio whispered histories into his dreams. Terpsichore danced barefoot through leaves while he played beside her, his fingers learning the rhythm of wind and body. Calliope taught him how to bend story into sound, while Euterpe pressed a flute into his hands and said only, "Listen." He listened. He absorbed truths that lived between words, the ache of longing in silence, the hush before a storm, the gasp of a child at first snow. The muses asked one thing in return: share beauty with mortals. Remind them the world still held music, even in grief. And he did. He sang in city forums, on battlefields, in quiet fields under open sky. His songs stitched fathers back to daughters, stirred revolutions, made enemies weep together. His fame spread, but so too did something else: ambition. For in the stillness of night, Melanian began to chase sounds no god had ever touched. He dreamt of a final song, one beyond language, one that could bend time, silence the wind, and stir even the fates. He worked in secret, writing fragments in caves where crystals hummed with strange resonance. He did not tell the muses. He no longer wished to share. When at last he finished, the world changed. Birds halted mid-flight, streams stilled. Even the fates lifted their heads from the loom of destiny. The song revealed all things: birth, death, sorrow, wonder. When the final note faded, the cave refused to echo it, as though the world itself knew repeating it would be a crime. The gods waited for him to sing it again. The muses urged him to share. Mortals begged to hear. But Melanian refused. "It is too sacred," he said. They would cheapen it. The muses grew sorrowful. "You were chosen to give beauty," one whispered, "not to hoard it." But he turned away. So the gods gave him no wrath, no fire, no thunder. They gave him silence. That night, Melanian dreamed the song again, clearer, brighter, more radiant than ever. He wept as he sang along, fingers strumming chords of light. But when he awoke, it was gone. Not a note remained, not a word, not a single echo. The next night, it returned in sleep, perfect, whole. And again, at dawn, gone. This became his curse, to hear the greatest song ever woven each night, but to wake each morning stripped of memory. He tried to outwit it. He scribbled notes in the dark, begged seers to carve fragments from his dreams, sang into mirrors, hoping his voice might betray what his mind forgot. But nothing remained. Night after night, he soared in ecstasy. Morning after morning, he wept in loss. Hope rotted into madness. He stopped performing, stopped teaching, stopped living. His voice grew ragged, his body frail, yet he wandered from town to town, asking strangers, "Have you heard it? The song with no beginning and no end." Some pitied him, others feared him. Children who once gathered to hear him sing now fled from his shadow. The name Melanian, once sung in praise, became a warning whispered in taverns. Do not end up like him. Yet still he dreamed. Each night, the song returned, whole and radiant, mocking his waking silence. He sang along with joy, only to wake in despair. At last, thin as twilight, he wandered to a cliff overlooking the sea. There he lay against the stone, the waves humming below. He closed his eyes, and in the dream, the song embraced him once more, not as torment, but as home. He sang until he was part of it, until the sound and the singer were one. When dawn came, he did not wake. A shepherd found him later, hands resting as if still cradling a lyre. They buried him beneath an olive tree by the cliffs. No monument was raised, no temple carved. But in the years that followed, travelers swore that on certain nights, if you stood upon those cliffs, the sea itself sang, a note too fleeting to name, too beautiful to forget. Musicians claimed they woke from dreams, with tears on their cheeks, unable to recall why. Children hummed fragments they had never been taught. And some nights, when a bard plucked a string in solitude, a perfect chord answered them, unbidden, then vanished with the dawn. The muses never spoke of him again, but they knew Melanian had not kept the song, he had become it. Not a warning, not a hero, a melody scattered across the world, waiting to be felt, in the silence before a storm, in the hush of grief, in the way the sea sighs against stone. And so his legend lingered, not remembered in words, but in the music that exists between them. Tonight, let us drift into a story carried on the strings of a lyre, a story that whispers of love stronger than stone, and of music that even death could not silence. This is the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice, a legend born of grief, beauty, and the fragile thread that binds longing to hope. Orpheus was no ordinary man. From his earliest breath, song moved through him as naturally as blood. His mother was Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and his father was said to be Apollo himself. With such lineage, the boy was bound to carry the weight of music in his very marrow. As he grew, his lyre sang with a voice unlike any other. When he plucked its strings, rivers slowed to listen. Trees bent their branches toward the sound, and even the stones seemed to lean closer, softened by notes they could not understand but longed to remember. It was said that Orpheus's voice was a balm to sorrow. In villages where grief ran deep, he would sing, and the heavy air would lighten. At weddings, he played until even the most stoic fathers wept with joy. At funerals, his music led the dead to their rest with gentleness, so the living felt comfort instead of terror. He was not a king, not a warrior, but in his hands lay something rarer, music that reminded the world it still had a soul. And then he met Eurydice. The stories say she was a nymph, though some claim she was mortal, a daughter of oak and river. What mattered was not her lineage, but her presence. When she entered a meadow, flowers straightened their stems. When she smiled, even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to be included in her joy. Orpheus saw her once, and it was enough. His music, which had charmed beasts and softened storms, faltered in her gaze. From that moment, every song belonged to her. They loved with a devotion that seemed untouched by shadow. Their laughter filled the hills, and the rivers carried their names in secret songs downstream. On their wedding day, the air itself was sweet with celebration, but as joy often does in myths, it called forth envy, accident, and fate. Eurydice wandered from the celebration into the fields, chasing after light-footed companions. In the grass lay a serpent, coiled unseen. Its fangs struck her ankle, swift as lightning, and in a breath, her laughter fell silent. The venom stole her life before the song of marriage could finish. When Orpheus found her, her eyes already dimmed, the lyre slipped from his hands. For days, he did not play. For nights, he did not sing. And then, when grief had filled him to the brim, he lifted his instrument and poured his sorrow into sound. The trees leaned, the rivers stilled, the animals lay down beside him. But the music did not heal him. It only sharpened his loss. And so he chose the unthinkable. He would descend into the underworld itself to bring her back. The underworld was no place for mortals, yet Orpheus set his feet upon that path with no sword, no shield, only his lyre. The road to Hades began at the mouth of a cavern where the world thinned into silence. Travelers said the air there grew colder, not with the bite of winter, but with the absence of life itself. Orpheus walked forward, and the sun fell behind him. He crossed the threshold and entered a twilight where no dawn ever followed. Shadows moved around him, faint shapes of the dead who had forgotten their names. Some drifted close, curious, but none dared touch him. His music called to them before his fingers even brushed the strings, as though the very memory of song had preceded him. At the banks of the Black River, he found the ferryman. Charon's face was hidden, but his oar struck the water with the weight of eternity. Normally, no living man could cross, but when Orpheus plucked a note, just one, the boat trembled. The ferryman paused, listening. The song spread like light through fog, and though Charon did not speak, he lifted his hand in silent permission. The oar dipped, and the vessel carried him across the Styx. On the far side, Cerberus stirred. 3 heads lifted, eyes burning amber in the gloom. The beast growled low, a sound like thunder behind a mountain. Its breath stank of ash and bone. Orpheus did not run. He raised his lyre and let sorrow fall from his fingers. The melody was not a battle cry, but a lullaby, a memory of warmth, of mothers cradling infants, of fields in spring. The great hound's ears twitched. One head tilted, another yawned. The third lay down upon its paws, and in that gentle silence, the poet passed. Deeper still, he wandered, past the ashen meadows, where shades lingered in endless grey. Some lifted their faces at the sound of his voice, and for the first time since death had claimed them, they wept. The song stirred faint sparks of what they had once been. Lovers, parents, warriors, children. The music was a reminder that they had mattered, even here. At last, he entered the halls of Hades, vast chambers of stone lit by fire that did not warm. The throne of the underworld rose in shadow. Upon it sat Hades, stern as the grave, and beside him Persephone, her face pale, but her eyes alive with both sorrow and wisdom. Orpheus fell to his knees and played. The song that poured forth was not meant for mortal ears. It carried the sweetness of first love and the bitterness of sudden loss. It was the laughter of Eurydice woven into strings, the silence that followed her last breath, the weight of an empty bed where her warmth had once been. His music was not defiance, it was devotion, raw and unguarded. The entire underworld stilled. The shades leaned close. Even the Furies, who thrived on punishment, lowered their torches. Hades listened, unmoving, though a flicker passed across his face, something ancient, like memory long buried. Persephone's eyes filled with tears. When the final note faded into silence, the queen of the underworld leaned to her husband. "Let her go," she whispered. "Let love have this one mercy." Hades' voice was stone, dragged across stone. "One condition," he said. "She will follow you back to the world above, but you must not look at her until you both stand beneath the sun." If you turn before then, she will remain here forever." Orpheus bowed his head. He would obey. They led Eurydice from the shadows. Her form was pale, her steps soundless, but her eyes glowed with recognition. She reached for him, and though his fingers ached to hold hers, he dared not touch. He turned instead to the path and began the long ascent. Behind him, her footsteps whispered softly in the dust. The road upward was long, steeper than memory, darker than grief. Orpheus walked with his lyre clutched close, each step echoing in the silence. Behind him came the soft trace of footsteps, light as a moth's wing. Eurydice followed, her presence so faint it might have been a dream. At first he felt certain. The bargain had been struck, and his song had bent even death to mercy. Yet as the tunnels stretched on and the air thickened, doubt crept in. What if the gods had deceived him? What if the footsteps behind him belonged not to her, but to shadow playing tricks? What if he climbed alone, carrying only hope into emptiness? He dared not speak her name. The rule was clear: do not look back. Trust was his only tether. So he counted the beats of his heart, matching them to the whisper of her steps. For a time, it was enough, but the ascent dragged on. Stone walls pressed close, dripping with unseen water. The tunnel twisted endlessly, and the air grew colder, thinner. Orpheus's chest burned. His mind trembled. Was she there? Or had the underworld sent only silence to mock him? Far ahead, the faintest light flickered, the promise of day. The exit widened, pale and golden, a breath of the world he longed to feel again. He stepped faster, eager, almost trembling, but with every pace, the doubt grew sharper. He could not hear her. The soft steps had vanished, swallowed by silence. Fear coiled in his throat. If he stepped into the light alone, if she was not truly there, what then? What cruelty had he trusted? He hesitated at the mouth of the tunnel, sunlight brushing his face. He wanted nothing more than to turn, to be sure. And he did. In that moment, the world paused. His eyes found her, Eurydice, only steps behind. Her hand reached out to him. Her face filled not with anger, but with tenderness, as though she had always known he would falter. Then she was gone. Her form thinned into mist, dissolving like dew at dawn. She whispered his name, soft, forgiving, and the dark claimed her once more. The echo of her presence faded, leaving nothing but stone and silence. Orpheus stood, frozen, his hand outstretched to air. The sunlight fell full upon him, warm, alive, but he felt nothing. Behind him the gate sealed shut, and Eurydice was lost again, this time forever. He did not scream. His lyre hung heavy at his side. Slowly, he walked into the light, each step colder than the one before. The world welcomed him back, yet it was empty. Meadows bloomed, rivers sang, but to Orpheus, all beauty had turned to ash. Orpheus wandered the earth with silence heavy on his lips. For days, for months, Perhaps for years, time blurred in grief, he touched his lyre, but the music that once carried joy had changed. It was no longer a song to delight kings or to lead lovers into dance. It was a lament, a cry woven with sorrow so deep that even the stones seemed to tremble. Men and women listened, and though the sound brought them to tears, they still gathered near. For in his grief, they felt their own reflected. Farmers paused in their fields to hear him. Children sat hushed at his feet, and even warriors wept as his music spoke of love so fierce it defied gods, yet so fragile it was undone by a single glance. But grief has sharp edges. Orpheus no longer sought company. Where once he had sung for weddings and feasts, he turned away from celebrations. He wandered alone through forests and mountains, refusing to love again. Some say he shunned women entirely, vowing never to risk such loss. Others claim he lived only for his music, carrying Eurydice's name in every note. His end came as all mortal ends do, sudden, cruel, and tinged with myth. In the wilds of Thrace, it was said, the Maenads, frenzied followers of Dionysus, came upon him. They had grown furious at his rejection of all others, his devotion to a ghost they could not see. In their fury, they tore him apart, scattering his body across the fields. But his head and his lyre, the heart of his song, did not fall silent. The river carried them together downstream. His lips still whispered her name, and the lyre still wept in harmony. Carried by water, they drifted to the sea, then to the island of Lesbos, where the Muses gathered his remains. From that day on, the island became a home of poets, a place where music and verse would flourish, echoing the memory of the one who loved too deeply. The gods themselves, some say, were moved. Zeus placed Orpheus's lyre among the constellations so that mortals could look up and remember that music had once stilled the underworld, had once nearly conquered death. And on clear nights, when the sky is dark and quiet, if you gaze toward the stars, you may still hear faint notes carried on the wind, the song of Orpheus, eternal, searching, never at rest. And Eurydice, legends are softer about her fate. Some whisper that she too was granted a place in the heavens, walking among the stars as a shadow beside his music. Others believe she remained in the underworld, but with Persephone's gentle care, waiting until the day the living and the dead would no longer be divided. Either way, theirs is not a tale of victory, but of devotion, of love tested by gods and undone by human doubt. A reminder that even the strongest heart may falter, and that sometimes the sweetest stories are not those that end in triumph, but in longing that lingers forever. Long before the seasons wore their familiar shapes, before spring was bound to flowers and winter to silence, there was a daughter of the harvest. Her name was Persephone. She was born of Demeter, goddess of grain, whose breath ripened fields and whose touch filled the world with plenty. Where Demeter walked, wheat bent heavy with gold, and where her daughter laughed, blossoms spilled from the earth as if eager to join her joy. Persephone's childhood was gentle. She ran through meadows with nimble feet, her arms woven with garlands of wildflowers, her hair catching the sun. Nymphs followed her like sisters, rivers mirrored her face, and even the animals softened when she passed. She was innocence itself, untouched by shadow. But the underworld had watched her. Hades, ruler of the dead, kept his throne in silence beneath the earth. He was not cruel, nor was he merciful. He was inevitable, as steady as the grave. His kingdom was vast, but empty of warmth. Though he ruled with dignity, he walked without laughter, and in that endless night, he longed for a presence to soften the stone around his heart. One day, as Persephone gathered flowers on the plain of Enna, a sudden beauty caught her eye. A bloom unlike any other, shimmering with impossible light. She reached for it, and the ground shuddered beneath her feet. The earth split open, and from its depths rose a chariot of obsidian, drawn by horses, black as shadow. Hades himself stood at the reins. Before the nymphs could scream, before Demeter could sense the loss, the god seized Persephone and swept her into his chariot. The earth closed behind them, sealing the meadow as though nothing had stirred. All that remained was the scattered garland she had dropped, trembling in the grass. Downward they plunged, into the veins of the world where no sunlight dwelled. Persephone clutched her flowers, petals falling like drops of blood along the passage. Hades spoke no threats, nor did he raise his voice. Instead, he looked upon her with a silence that burned heavier than chains. She was to be his queen, his companion in the halls of shadow. Above, Demeter felt the absence like a wound. She searched the earth, calling her daughter's name across valleys and mountains, but no answer came. Days became nights. Nights became weeks, and her grief grew into wrath. She struck the fields with barrenness. Seeds refused to sprout, rivers dried, and famine stalked the land. Mortals raised their hands in prayer, but she would not be comforted. Until Persephone was returned, the earth itself would mourn. And so the world shivered in its first true winter. The underworld was unlike anything Persephone had ever known. Its skies were not skies at all, but a cavernous darkness pierced by rivers of fire and veins of glowing stone. Shadows drifted like smoke, and the air tasted of iron and silence. Hades' palace stood at the heart of it, a fortress of black rock, vast halls echoing with the soft weeping of shades. There, Persephone wandered like a bird trapped beneath stone. Hades offered her a throne beside his own, a crown wrought of onyx and gems carved from the bones of the earth. Yet when she touched it, it felt cold, as though it pulsed with grief. She did not speak at first, for terror sealed her lips. But when she looked at him, at this solemn god who had stolen her from sunlight, she saw not cruelty in his eyes, but a hunger for belonging, a loneliness carved deep. Still, she longed for her mother. Above, Demeter scoured the world. She disguised herself as a mortal woman and wandered the roads of men, asking every village, every shepherd, every spring, if they had seen her daughter. None could help her. When she discovered the truth that Persephone had been taken, her grief became fury. She struck the earth barren. Grain withered, vines blackened, and hunger spread like fire. The cries of mortals rose to Olympus. Zeus, Lord of gods, could not ignore the devastation. Crops failed, temples emptied, and prayers carried only despair. He called for Hermes, fleet-footed messenger, and ordered him to descend to Hades with a decree. Persephone must be returned, or the world would starve. In the underworld, Hermes found Persephone pale but unbroken. She longed to leave, to see the sun once more. Hades, however, did not yield easily. He argued that she had brought color to his silent realm, that even the dead stirred with faint hope at her presence. Without her, his halls would return to cold emptiness. But Hermes reminded him of Zeus's command. If Persephone did not return, the gods themselves would be forced into war. Hades listened in silence, and for the first time, sorrow bent his head. He agreed she could go, yet fate weaves tighter threads than desire. Before Persephone left, Hades offered her a gift, a single pomegranate, split open with seeds glistening like drops of blood. Hungry and weary, she tasted one, pressing its sweetness to her lips. She did not know the rule, that those who consume the food of the underworld are forever bound to it. When Hermes led her away, Hades stood watching. He did not call out. He only let her go, though a shadow crossed his face, as if he already knew the compromise to come. Above, Demeter saw her child again, and joy lit the earth. Grass sprang green, wheat lifted golden, and flowers burst through the thawing soil. But the joy was not unbroken, for when the truth of the pomegranate was revealed, Zeus himself gave judgment. Persephone would divide her time between the two worlds. For part of the year, she would remain with her mother, bringing spring and summer to the earth. For the other part, she would dwell beside Hades as queen of the dead, and winter would cloak the land in mourning. Thus, the seasons were born, cycles of reunion and separation, of plenty and famine, joy and sorrow. Persephone's return to the earth was radiant. When she walked through meadows, the grass leapt to life. Buds cracked open, trees blossomed, and the world seemed to breathe again. Demeter held her tightly, unwilling to let go, and mortals danced in relief as famine melted into plenty. For those months, Persephone was once more the maiden of flowers, the daughter of spring, her laughter scattering petals like rain. But when the time came for her descent, the earth hushed. Demeter wept, clutching her daughter as though her arms could anchor her. Yet Persephone had tasted the pomegranate, and the law of the underworld could not be broken. Slowly, she walked back into shadow, her steps trailing blossoms that withered as soon as they touched the ground. At first, she entered Hades' realm as a captive, but over the cycles, something within her began to change. She was no longer only the maiden who played among meadows. She became queen. The shades who wandered in silence now looked to her for gentleness. When she passed, their murmurs softened. She listened to their sorrows, and for the first time, the dead felt seen. Even Hades himself began to shift in her presence. Though he remained stern and immovable, he gave her authority beside him. When disputes arose among the shades, it was Persephone's voice that soothed them. When grief clung to newly arrived souls, it was her touch that eased their crossing. The underworld, once a place of despair alone, began to hold a strange dignity, touched by her dual nature. Above, poets whispered that Persephone had become more powerful than any goddess of Olympus, for she alone walked in both realms. She was not only spring's blossom, but winter's silence. She embodied both life's abundance and death's inevitability. She carried grief and joy in equal measure, and so mortals saw in her the truth of existence itself. The seasons turned, year upon year, and with every her story deepened. To the grieving, she was a comfort, for she had known loss. To the hopeful, she was a promise, for she always returned. And to the gods, she was a reminder that even Olympus could not rule without balance. Thus, Persephone became more than a daughter stolen, more than a queen enthroned. She became the bridge between worlds, the reason the earth blooms and withers, the reason mortals mourn and rejoice. Every seed that breaks through soil in spring carries her name, and every withered leaf that falls in autumn echoes her descent. And so her tale endures, not only as tragedy, nor only as romance, but as the very rhythm of life, loss and return, shadow and light, silence and song. Long ago, on the island of Crete, there stood a maze no mortal could master. The labyrinth, they called it, its walls coiled like the mind of a god, endless corridors twisting in ways that mocked reason. At its heart lived a monster, half man and half bull, born of curse and secrecy, the Minotaur. This beast devoured the flesh of those cast into its prison. For every 9 years, Athens was forced to send tribute to Crete. 7 young men and 7 young women, doomed to wander the maze until the Minotaur found them. Their cries faded into silence, their names forgotten by all but grieving parents. Athens bent beneath this burden until a prince rose with fire in his heart. His name was Theseus, son of King Augeas. He was bold, clever, and unyielding. When the time came for Athens to send its victims once more, he volunteered. Not as sacrifice, but as defiance. He vowed that this time the ship would not return in mourning. He would slay the monster and end Crete's tyranny. When his ship reached Knossos, the court of King Minos, Theseus strode among the chosen victims without fear. His resolve caught the eye of one who watched in secret, Ariadne, daughter of Minos. She was young, but she saw in him not just bravery, but possibility. For though her father ruled Crete with power, his reign was darkened by the shadow of the labyrinth. Ariadne's heart stirred with both pity and longing, and she resolved to help the stranger. By night, she sought him out. The labyrinth is not meant to be solved, she whispered. It devours hope as surely as it devours flesh. But if you truly wish to defeat the beast, you must carry a thread. She placed in his hand a simple ball of twine. Tie it at the entrance and let it unspool behind you. Only then will you find your way back. Theseus looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he felt that his quest might be possible. He swore by the gods that if he triumphed, he would carry her away from Crete, free of her father's shadow. She placed her faith in him, and as dawn broke, she gave him the thread that would become legend. The victims were led into the labyrinth, the great stone doors slamming shut behind them. Darkness swallowed all sound, save for the shuffle of feet and the distant snort of the beast. Theseus tied the thread to the entrance and stepped forward, every step echoing into the unknown. The air was damp, the walls slick with age, corridors doubled back on themselves, stairs led to dead ends, and shadows stretched unnaturally long. Yet Theseus walked with certainty, his hand always guiding the twine, his other hand gripping the hilt of his sword. Somewhere deep within, A roar shook the labyrinth, low and guttural, rattling the stone. The Minotaur had scented prey. The sound of the roar reverberated through the walls, a reminder that the labyrinth was alive, breathing with the monster at its center. The other youths clung to each other, trembling, but Theseus pressed forward. He told them to stay near the entrance of the thread, to follow it back if they could, for he alone would face the beast. The corridors grew narrower, the ceilings lower, the air thick as if the stone itself wished to suffocate intruders. Then came silence, heavy and waiting. Theseus slowed, his sword raised, listening to the faint scrape of hooves against stone. The Minotaur was near. It burst from the shadows with the force of a storm, towering, horned, its eyes red with fury. Its human frame rippled with muscle, its bull's head lowered in a charge that shook the walls. Theseus leapt aside, the beast crashing into the stone where he had stood. Sparks flew as its horns gouged rock, but the Minotaur wheeled, bellowing ready again. Theseus attacked, his blade flashing in the dark. Steel bit into hide, drawing blood, but the monster did not falter. It swung a massive arm, striking him across the chamber, his breath torn from his lungs. His sword clattered across the floor. The Minotaur advanced, snorting, each step pounding like a drumbeat of doom. But Theseus was cunning as well as strong. He rolled, seizing the twine, still in his hand, and yanked it taut across the passage. The charging beast stumbled, horns clipping the wall, its bulk staggering forward. In that instant, Theseus lunged for his sword, driving it upward with all his strength. The blade pierced beneath the beast's jaw, through flesh and bone, until the roar choked into silence. The Minotaur fell, its massive body crashing into the stone, trembling once before it stilled. The echo faded, leaving only the sound of Theseus's own heartbeat. The labyrinth, for the first time, seemed quiet. He wiped the blood from his sword and gathered the others. Guiding them with Ariadne's thread, he retraced his steps through the maze. Corridor after corridor unwound until at last the faint outline of the entrance appeared. When the doors opened, the youths stumbled into the night air. Alive, Ariadne was waiting. When her eyes met Theseus's, hope shone in them like fire. He kept his vow. He would take her away, far from her father's shadow. Together they fled Crete under cover of darkness, sailing across the sea. Behind them, the labyrinth still stood, silent as a tomb, its beast slain, its purpose ended. But fate is not kind to heroes. The sea stretched endless and blue as the ship carried Theseus, Ariadne, and the liberated youths away from Crete. The air was filled with laughter and relief. After years of fear, the Athenians were free of their dreadful tribute. Theseus stood tall at the helm, his sword still sticky with the blood of the Minotaur, his name already shaping itself into legend. But as the days passed, shadows began to settle over the bright promise of victory. Ariadne, who had betrayed her father and risked her life for love, lingered by Theseus's side with a heart unguarded. She spoke of their future, of Athens, of marriage beneath the gods' gaze. She saw him not only as a hero, but as the very center of her destiny. Yet Theseus's eyes wandered elsewhere. To him, Ariadne had been a means to an end, a gift of thread and faith that had made his triumph possible. Gratitude tied him to her, but not devotion. When the ship anchored at the island of Naxos, the company disembarked to rest. The youth slept on the sand, exhausted from days at sea. Ariadne lay nearby, dreaming of wedding garlands and golden temples, a life reborn far from the shadows of Crete. But in the hush of night, Theseus made his decision. Silently, he ordered the sails raised. The ship slipped from the shore like a thief, leaving Ariadne behind. When dawn broke, she woke to find the sand empty and the horizon bare, save for a receding vessel. At first, she thought it a cruel jest. She ran to the edge of the surf, calling his name, her voice cracking with disbelief. But the ship did not turn. Her cries echoed across the island, rising with the gulls. Ariadne fell to her knees, clutching the sand in her fists, tasting betrayal, bitter as salt. She had defied her father, her people, her gods for this man, and he had left her, discarded like an offering no longer needed. Alone, she wept until her throat was raw, the sea swallowing her sorrow. Yet the gods do not always leave mortals broken. Some tell that Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy, came upon her in her despair. Where Theseus had abandoned her, Dionysus lifted her, crowned her with ivy, and made her his immortal bride. In the stars, he set her crown as a constellation, the Corona Borealis, so her faith would never be forgotten. But on that morning, Ariadne knew only grief, her heart hollowed by betrayal. Meanwhile, Theseus sailed on, silent as stone. Perhaps guilt stirred in him, though he did not speak it. Perhaps ambition drowned out remorse. For Athens awaited him, and he sought to stand not only as hero, but as king. But fate had set one final snare. Before Theseus left Athens, he had promised his father, King Aegeus, a signal. If he triumphed, he would raise white sails upon his return. If he perished, the sails would remain black. As the ship neared the cliffs of Athens, The black sails still hung against the sky, forgotten in his pride, or perhaps darkened by grief he would not name. High upon the cliffs, Aegeus kept vigil, scanning the horizon each day for his son. When he saw the black sails, his heart broke. Believing his son slain, he cast himself into the sea. The waters closed over him, and his name was given to them, the Aegean Sea, forever bearing the memory of a father's despair. When Theseus finally set foot upon the shore, the city did not greet him with feasts and garlands, but with silence. His father was gone, his triumph marred. He had slain the Minotaur, yes, but he had betrayed Ariadne, and by his forgetfulness, or perhaps his arrogance, he had driven his father to death. Victory and tragedy walked hand in hand at his side. And so the tale of Theseus is remembered not as pure glory, but as a labyrinth of its own, one of choices, betrayals, and consequences. He mastered the twisting corridors of Crete, but he could not master the tangled pathways of his own heart. In the end, it was not the Minotaur that undid him, but the flaws of his own humanity. The labyrinth lies silent, the monster long dead, but in every telling of the story it becomes clear. The true maze is the one each of us carries within, and no thread can always lead us safely out.